I was there the morning my brother lost his heart, and I was there the night she finally learned the truth. Between those 2 days lay 7 years of the most stubbornly kept secret I have ever been made to hold, and I will confess that it cost me considerable effort not to tell her myself on at least 4 separate occasions. My brother, the Duke of Carnstoke, a man who could silence a ballroom with a glance and bring a minister's position to ruin by Tuesday, made me swear an oath of silence, and he wore the same expression when he extracted it from me that he wore when he was 16 and had just broken our father's favorite hunting rifle. Absolute, immovable, faintly haunted. I am Lord Edmund Harcastle, younger brother, and I tell you this story because my brother refuses to. He says it is hers to tell, or no one's. But she insists it belongs to both of them equally, and since she is now the Duchess of Carnstoke and outranks us both in her quiet, dignified way, I believe I am permitted to speak. It began in the autumn of the year my brother returned from the northern campaign. Or rather, it began 4 months before that, in a village called Ashwick Hollow, where a girl named no one important was carrying a basket of mending through a market square in the rain. She was not no one important. She was Miss Cecily Vane, the only daughter of the late Mr. Aldous Vane, a man of modest inheritance who had spent the better part of his life being exquisitely good at being swindled. When he died, he left Cecily a rented cottage, a pile of creditors' letters that reached past her knee, and a reputation in the village of Ashwick Hollow as that poor Vane girl, which she bore with the particular quiet dignity of someone who has decided that the only thing she can control is how straight she holds her spine. I know these things not because I was there for that rainy autumn morning. I was not. But because my brother told them to me, very slowly, over 2 glasses of the good brandy, staring at the fire in the manner of a man who is trying to remember every detail precisely and is afraid of getting even one wrong. He had come through Ashwick Hollow on his way north, passing through not by any plan, but because a thrown horseshoe had put him 2 hours behind, and the weather was making the upper road impassable. He was traveling without ceremony, no outriders, no liveried carriage, because he had learned in his years of public life that ceremony produced a kind of theater around him that made it impossible to observe anything true. He wore a plain riding coat, his horse had no livery, and the one man with him was his valet Reese, who had been in the family 30 years and knew when to speak and when to become invisible. He saw her first from the saddle, coming out of a tailor's doorway into the rain. She was carrying a basket covered with oilskin against the wet, and she did not hesitate or curse the rain or duck back into the doorway. She simply put her head down and walked. There was something in the walk, he said this part slowly, turning the brandy glass, something that told him the rain was not a new difficulty for her. She moved like someone who had learned to expect difficulty and had decided that walking directly through it was the only sensible option. Then she slipped on a loose stone at the market square's edge. She did not fall. She caught herself against a wooden post with one hand, the basket swinging wide, and recovered in a single, practiced motion, and then she looked up and her eyes met his, and he had the distinct impression she was slightly annoyed at having been seen to stumble at all. She had dark eyes. He mentioned this 3 times during that first telling, which I noted. He dismounted, a fact I found remarkable, knowing my brother, and asked if she was all right. She said she was perfectly well, thank you, and that the stone had always been loose and the parish had been meant to address it for 2 years. There was no performance of gratitude or fluster. She spoke to him as she might speak to any passing rider who happened to be on the right side of the square. He asked because he is my brother and he cannot help himself, whether the basket was heavy. She said it was mending for 3 households and it weighed what mending weighs, and if he was asking because he thought she needed help, she managed perfectly well. Then she looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes and said, "But I thank you for asking. Not everyone does." And that was all. She pulled her coat closer, shifted the basket to her other arm, and walked on through the rain, as directly and without ceremony as she had come out of the doorway. My brother watched her go. Reese watched my brother watching her go. Neither of them said anything until they had left the square. "Who is she?" my brother asked. Reese, who managed to learn the history of any town within 20 minutes of stopping in it, told him what he had already gathered from the stable boy and the woman at the inn. Miss Cecily Vane, daughter of the late Aldous Vane, not a penny to her name, mending and taking in small commissions to keep her cottage and her debts from swallowing her whole. No family left in the county, generally regarded as capable but unfortunate. My brother rode north. He had a campaign to rejoin and responsibilities that did not pause for him. He was, in any meaningful sense of the word, one of the most sought-after unmarried men in England, with 3 county seats, a London house, and a title that made matchmaking mothers straighten in their chairs. He had every reason to put the girl in the rain behind him and not think of her again. I asked him once later why he didn't. He considered it for a long time. Then he said, "She didn't perform for me, she was simply herself. I have not met many people who do that." I thought about pointing out that she had not known who he was, and that not performing for a passing stranger in the rain required rather less courage than not performing for a duke. But I held my tongue, because the expression on his face was not the expression of a man making an argument. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and was finally setting it down on the table where someone else could see it. He returned from the north 8 months later. The campaign had been brutal, and the settlement had been bruising, and he had lost 2 good men he grieved privately, as he grieved everything without display. He came back to Carnstoke House and spent a week going through his correspondence, a task that generally took 3 days and required during that week 3 times the usual quantity of coal for the fire. Among his letters, forwarded from one of the northern posts, was a note from a firm of solicitors in the village nearest Ashwick Hollow. It was a routine creditor's notice, the kind that circulates when a debt is in danger of going to default, and the creditors are sounding out any party who might have some connection. The debt was a linen merchant's claim against the late Mr. Aldous Vane's estate, inheritable by his surviving daughter, and the sum was not enormous by any standard my brother operated in. It was enormous by the standard of a woman taking in mending. He stared at it for a time, then he called for Rees. "Find me," he said, "a solicitor in the county of Norwell who is not known to have any connection with Carnstoke or this house. A competent one, a discreet one." Rees found him one by the end of the week. My brother settled the debt. He did it through the solicitor, through a charitable account established for that purpose under a name that was not his, and he wrote one instruction at the top of the instruction sheet in his own hand. Under no circumstances is the name of the benefactor to be conveyed to Miss Vane or to anyone in her acquaintance. That is how it began. I learned of it 6 months later, when my brother made the error of writing the wrong figure in a household account, and I caught the discrepancy while reviewing the quarterly ledgers with his steward. My brother, to his credit, did not deny it when I confronted him. He poured us both brandy, explained the situation with the sort of spare efficiency he used for military briefings, and then looked at me and said, "I need you to swear you won't say a word." I pointed out that the girl in question did not know he existed as anything beyond a passing stranger in the rain. "Correct," he said. I pointed out that she could not, therefore, regard him with any particular gratitude or feeling, since she did not know the benefactor was him. "Also correct," he said. I asked him what precisely he intended. He said, "Nothing. I intend nothing. I simply did not want her to lose the cottage." I swore the oath. I want it noted, for the record, that I swore it under some duress, because even at that stage I could see the shape of what was happening to my brother, which was that he was falling in love as helplessly and completely as any man I had ever watched fall, and doing it at a distance, in secret, with no plan and no hope, and a rigid determination not to impose himself where he had no right to be. I have known my brother all my life. He has always been, underneath the title and the silence and the fear he inspires without trying, a man of almost excessive conscience. He would not go to her. He would not present himself. He would not allow himself to be discovered. Because to do so, he said, when I pushed him once, would be to place her in the position of feeling obliged, and she had had quite enough, he thought, of obligation. So he said nothing and did nothing, except continue to pay the debts quietly and ask Rees, when the valet was next in the county for other business, to ascertain without drawing attention that Miss Vane was well. Rees reported that she was. He also reported, in the precise, spare way of a man who chooses his words like a man choosing stones to cross a river, that she had begun to teach 2 of the village children their letters in the evenings, for no pay, because she felt they were going to be left behind otherwise. My brother, when this was conveyed to him, said nothing. He pressed his lips together and looked out the window for a moment, and then asked if there was anything else in the day's correspondence. This went on for 2 years. In the third year, her cottage roof failed in a February storm. The damage was extensive, 3 rafters gone, the front room exposed to the sky, and the landlord, a man of no particular generosity, declined to repair it on the grounds that it was a rented property, and the cost exceeded what he was prepared to invest. There was a letter from a local vicar in Ashwick Hollow to a charitable trust in London, asking for emergency repair funds, and this letter somehow, don't ask me how, because I did ask my brother and he declined to explain the mechanism, found its way to Reese. The repairs were completed within a fortnight. The charitable trust's agent arrived, inspected the damage, engaged the local carpenter and 2 laborers, and the cottage roof was sound again before the next frost. The trust sent no explanation and asked for no credit. The vicar was quietly bewildered and deeply grateful. Cecily Vane, I am told, spent a morning on her knees thanking God and the charitable trust, and whoever had moved them to care about one small cottage in Ashwick Hollow. She did not know there was no charitable trust. She did not know that the trust's sole endowment was a man in a London house who had been carrying her quietly in his conscience since a rainy afternoon in a market square. He saw her again in the 5th year. It was not by design, or it was by design in the way that a man who has been telling himself he is not going to do a thing eventually, without quite meaning to, does the thing. He was traveling through Norwell on legitimate business, had every reason not to deviate to Ashwick Hollow, and deviated nonetheless, arriving at the edge of the village on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. She was in the churchyard. Not mourning, she was helping the elderly sexton clear away winter debris from the graves, raking the dead leaves and piling them at the gate. She was wearing a plain dark coat and working gloves, and she had her hair pinned up under a practical bonnet. She looked precisely as he had imagined she would look doing precisely that kind of task. Direct, focused, and entirely unimpressed by either the indignity or the labor. He did not speak to her. He watched from the lane for perhaps 3 minutes. He was not proud of it, he told me later, and then he put his horse back on the road and continued to his business in Norwell. But he came back through Ashwick Hollow on the return, and this time he stopped at the inn, and he was in the inn's front room when Cecily Vane came in to collect a mending order from the innkeeper's wife. She was 5 feet away before she saw him. He stood. She stopped. There was a beat of silence in which, I imagine, neither of them quite knew what to say, which is rare for my brother and perhaps unprecedented for her. She said, "The passing rider from the market square." He said, "Yes, I hope the stone has been repaired." She said it had not, and that she had raised it again at the last parish meeting and been told it was on the list, which was not, as she understood it, any shorter than it had been 2 years ago. He almost smiled. She saw it, he could tell, he said, because she looked at him as though she was recalibrating something. They spoke for perhaps 12 minutes. He did not tell her his name. She did not ask. She collected her order, thanked the innkeeper's wife, and left with the same directness with which she did everything. He rode back to Carnstoke House and was very quiet for a week. In the 6th year, she fell ill. Not gravely. A lung complaint that lingered through a wet autumn and would not resolve, and the village physician said she needed a warmer room and rest and nourishing food, none of which she had in sufficient quantity. Reese's quarterly report. Yes, by this time Reese was making quarterly reports, a fact that Reese accepted with the composure of a man who has long since made his peace with the particular shape of the Harcastle family. Mentioned the illness and mentioned, with the same careful neutrality, that a neighbor had said Miss Vane had refused to ask anyone for assistance because she had been asking for too long, and the asking had become a weight she didn't know how to put down. A package arrived at the cottage a week later. Coal for the grate, a cured ham, a jar of the kind of amber honey that keeps its warmth halfway through a spoonful, a wool blanket so fine it could only have come from a house that thought nothing of such things, and a note in a hand she did not recognize that said only, "A friend who wishes you well." She recovered. She told the vicar about the package, and they puzzled over it together. She had no admirers that anyone knew of, no distant relations with means, no creditors who had ever behaved charitably. The vicar suggested it might be the same trust that had fixed her roof. She said she thought perhaps it was, and that she was going to spend the rest of her life being grateful to whatever force in the world had seen her clearly enough to keep sending such things. I tell you, when Reese related that to my brother, I happened to be in the room. My brother received it with his usual stillness. And then he turned away and looked at the window for a long moment, and I saw something in his face that I had not seen since our mother's death 20 years before, a kind of private, unguarded grief, not for loss, but for what he had deliberately kept himself from. I opened my mouth. He turned back and looked at me, and I shut it again. "Don't," he said. "She doesn't know you," I said, because I felt someone had to say it. "She doesn't know you exist as anything more than a stranger at an inn." "I know that." 7 years, Edmund. "I know. If you go to her, it need not be as her benefactor. It could simply be as a man who—" "She would feel the obligation," he said. "The moment she knew, she would feel it. That is not how I want." He stopped. He pressed his thumb against the edge of his signet ring the way he does when he is containing something. "She deserves to be free of obligation. She has never had that. I am not going to add my name to the list of things she owes." I wanted to argue. I did not argue because I understood. My brother is, as I said, a man of excessive conscience, and beneath the logic was something more fragile. A fear that if she were ever to look at him with the expression of a woman tallying what she owes, he would not survive it. He had watched her from the lane and stood in an inn and read Reese's quarterly reports for 7 years, and what he had built very quietly was something he could not risk losing by reaching for it clumsily. It resolved itself in the 7th year, and not by any plan of his. He was in Norwell on legitimate business. Genuinely, this time, a matter of some property transactions in the northern county, and he was staying 2 nights at the Norwell Assembly Rooms attached lodgings, which was slightly less grand than his usual standard, and which he chose because the alternative would have required a household staff, and a fanfare he was not in the mood for. He was at a small dinner given by the local magistrate, 17 people, county families, polite conversation, and he was seated beside a woman he did not immediately recognize. She recognized him. He saw it in the moment the footman introduced them, the slight pause, the recalibration behind her eyes, the same look he had seen at the inn. She said nothing. She sat. The soup was served. "You are the man from the inn at Ashwick Hollow," she said very quietly under the table conversation. "And from the market square before that." "Yes," he said. "You gave your name as Mr. Harcastle." "That is my name." He had never lied to her, technically. He had simply offered the lesser portion of the truth. She looked at him sideways. "And the rest of your name, Mr. Harcastle?" A pause, the Duke of Carnstoke. She was quiet for a moment. She took a small, deliberate sip of water. Then she said, with the measured restraint of someone keeping something carefully in hand, "I see." That was all she said for the duration of the soup. He said the conversation over the fish course was the longest of his life, and it was conducted entirely in silence. By the time the roasted pheasant arrived, she turned to him again and said, "There is a charitable trust that has been keeping me from ruin for a considerable number of years." "Yes," he said, because there was no longer any point in evasion. "Are you it?" "I have contributed to it, yes." Another pause, the pheasant went cold. She said very quietly, "How long?" 7 years. She pressed her lips together, and he could not tell. He told me this was the worst moment, the moment of not knowing, whether the expression was anger or grief or something else entirely. "Why?" she asked. He said, "Because you did not perform for me in the rain. Because you walked through difficulty as though it were simply weather. Because every report I received of you described someone I had no right to." He stopped, gathered himself in the way of a man who has gone further than he meant to go and knows there is no useful stopping now. "I had no claim on you. I had no wish to impose one. But I could not. I found that I could not be entirely indifferent to your circumstances, and so I did what I was able to in the only way that would not." "Oblige me," she said. "Yes." The table around them hummed with 17 other conversations. She was very still. "You thought I would feel obliged," she said slowly, working through it, "and you did not want that." "Correct. So instead you spent 7 years. She stopped, and something in her voice changed, something that made him go very still. 7 years of not knowing whether I was well except through. How did you find out? Do you have people watching me?" "My valet makes periodic inquiries," he said. "Nothing more. I wanted to be assured you were safe." "Your valet?" "He is very discreet." She turned to look at him directly for the first time since the soup, and her dark eyes were doing something complicated that he said he could not fully describe. and that I believe was the expression of a woman who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that the discovery she has not been alone is almost too large to hold all at once. She said, "The roof." "Yes." "And the coal last autumn, and the honey." "Yes." A pause. "You sent honey." "You were ill," he said, as though this were a sufficient explanation, and apparently for him it was. She looked away at the table, at her hands. A muscle moved in her jaw. He waited because he had learned in 20 years of managing the affairs of a large estate and a larger family and a demanding public life that there are moments when the correct act is simply to wait. "I cried over that honey," she said at last, very quietly, not performing grief, stating a fact. "I sat on the floor of my cottage and I held that jar and I cried for half an hour because someone had thought to send it, and I did not know who. I thought of every person in my life who might have done such a thing, and I could not." She stopped, pressed her fingers to the edge of her plate. "I could not account for it." He said, "I am sorry it caused you distress." "It didn't cause me distress," she said, with a sharpness that surprised him. "It caused me grief of the kind that comes from being seen. When you are not accustomed to being seen, the sensation is," she drew a breath, "it is a great deal." The table around them had gone, as far as either of them was concerned, entirely elsewhere. He said, "Miss Vane, I should have told you years ago. I did not because I was a coward in the specific way of men who are afraid of doing the wrong thing and so do the unhelpful thing instead, which is nothing. I am telling you now, which is 7 years late, and I am not going to dress it in anything other than what it is." She looked at him. "What is it?" He said, and I know this because he told me the next morning with the expression of a man who has done something irrevocable and is quietly grateful for it. "It is care. It has always been care. It was care before I had any right to it, and it continued to be care long after I had accepted that I would never have any right to it. And if you tell me that is an imposition and ask me to cease, I will cease, and I will do so without any grievance because you owe me nothing. Precisely nothing. I want you to understand that. You owe me nothing. What was given freely." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "When we spoke at the inn 5 years ago, did you know then?" "Yes." "And you said nothing." "I did not feel I had the right to." "You felt you had the right to send honey," she said, with a faint, exhausted note in her voice that was not quite humor and was not quite reproach, "but not to tell me your name." He said, "I recognize the inconsistency." She pressed her lips together against something. He thought it might be a smile, the first one, the involuntary kind. She recovered it quickly. They sat through the rest of dinner, in a silence that was entirely different from the silence that had preceded the pheasant. He walked her to the door of the assembly rooms at the evening's end, and she stood at the top of the steps in her plain dark coat with her gloves in her hands and looked at him with those dark eyes, and he looked back. She said, "I do not know what to do with 7 years of honey and coal and roof repairs, and a man who apparently found it easier to keep his identity secret from me than to cross a room." He said, "I find most things easier than crossing a room toward someone He stopped. "You have always frightened me a great deal, Miss Vane, which I acknowledge is a strange thing for me to say." She looked at him for a long moment. "I have frightened the Duke of Carnstoke." "Considerably." "By walking through a market square in the rain." "You did not perform for me," he said again. "I have found in my life that very few people do not perform for me, and the experience of standing in a room with someone who is simply, entirely themselves, who doesn't shift or shade or arrange themselves for the benefit of my rank." He pressed the edge of his glove against his fingers, the gesture of a man finishing a thought he had been working toward for 7 years. "I did not know how to approach it. So I did what I could from a distance and called it care, and told myself it was enough." "Was it?" she asked. He said no. She was quiet. The night air moved between them, cold and clear. Then she said, "The stone in the market square still is not repaired." He looked at her. "I will see to it." "That," she said, "is not what I meant." She pulled her gloves on, slowly looking at her hands. "I meant that we are standing here in this cold, and I do not yet know what you are asking me." He said, "I am asking whether you might be willing to allow me to call on you, with my name this time, in the ordinary way of things, and whether, over time and without obligation and with full understanding that you owe me nothing and I expect nothing, you might be willing to let me try to be simply a man and not a benefactor." She looked up at him. He said, "I would very much like to cross the room." And she said, with the quiet, direct certainty of someone who has been walking through difficulty long enough to know when a path has finally opened, "Then cross it." He called on her the following week, and the week after that, and the one after that, and she greeted him each time with the same level gaze and the same complete absence of performance that had undone him in a market square 7 years before. And each time he left her cottage gate, he stood outside it for a moment with the expression of a man who cannot entirely believe his luck. She was curious about him. Genuinely curious, the way she was curious about everything, asking direct questions about the campaign, about the estate, about what it cost him to inhabit the role the world required of him. No one asked him that. Most people assumed he inhabited it effortlessly. She looked at him with those dark eyes and asked whether the weight of it ever became simply a weight. He told her yes. She nodded as though she had suspected as much, and offered him another cup of tea, and they sat in her small cottage parlor in the lamplight with the sound of the wind outside, and he thought he had never in his life felt less like a duke and more like a man. He proposed in the spring, in the churchyard where he had watched her from the lane, because he said he thought it was appropriate to do it in the place where he had first understood what he felt. He said it without ceremony, not on one knee, not with a ring produced from a coat pocket, just standing beside her with his hands in his coat and his voice very quiet. He said he loved her, that he had loved her for 7 years in the only way he had known how, and that he would like, if she would permit him, to spend whatever was left of his life learning how to do it better, in her presence rather than at a distance. She said yes before he had entirely finished. She cried just slightly, and he looked as though he had been given something he had always believed he had no right to expect. I know all of this because I was watching from the gate, because my brother had told me the night before what he intended to do, and when I had asked whether he wanted me there, he had said no, and then said, "But if you happen to be walking past the churchyard at around 11 in the morning, I suppose I cannot stop you." I happened to be walking past at 11. The wedding was in autumn, 3 months later at the church in Ashwick Hollow. The same vicar who had puzzled over the charitable trust's repairs presided, without knowing until the morning of the wedding that the mysterious trust and the groom were the same person, at which point he sat down and put his head in his hands and then stood up again, and said he would consider it one of the more remarkable things he had witnessed in 30 years of parish work. The market square stone was repaired the week before the ceremony. My brother arranged it himself, without mentioning it to her. She noticed the morning of the wedding, walking through the square to the church, and she stopped and looked at it and then looked at him, and he shrugged with the absolute composure of a man who has done something and intends to underplay it enormously. She took his arm and they walked on through the square, and the village turned out in the watery autumn sunshine to watch a woman they had always known as capable and unfortunate walk into a church on the arm of a man who looked at her the way you look at the thing you have been most afraid of losing. I gave the toast at the wedding breakfast. I kept it short, because neither of them is interested in ceremony, and because the truth of the thing was already known to everyone in the room. That love, in some cases, is not a single crossing of a floor, but a 7-year negotiation between what a man feels he has the right to do and what he cannot stop himself from doing in spite of it, conducted largely through solicitors and quarterly reports, and a jar of honey delivered in the dark. I told them I was honored to have kept the secret, which was true, and that I hoped the next 7 years would be conducted somewhat more directly, which made the new Duchess of Carnstoke laugh. A sound I am pleased to report is not rare, and which still has the effect on my brother of stopping him mid-sentence and making him look at her as though he has only just realized she is there, and intends to go on being there, and has decided this is the most astonishing thing that has ever happened to him. It probably is.